He threw the letter at her feet in front of every ranch hand on the property. Not handed it, not set it on the table, threw it the way a man tosses garbage he's done looking at. "Read it," Gideon Hawthorne said, loud enough for the 12 men standing behind him to hear every word. "Read what your own father wrote about you before he sent you out here." Clara Whitmore stood in the dirt beside the wagon that had carried her 300 miles. Her 2 suitcases sat beside her boots. The paper had landed face up, and she could already see her father's handwriting from where she stood. She didn't move to pick it up. I said, "Read it." One of the cowboys near the fence laughed, not loudly, just enough. Clara looked at the letter on the ground. Then she looked at the man who had thrown it, Mo. Then she bent down, picked it up. Teslavkin folded it in half without reading a single word, slid it into her coat pocket. "I already know what it says," she told him quietly. "Packed my own bags." Nobody laughed after that. If you've ever walked into a room and felt every eye in it deciding you weren't enough before you opened your mouth, this story is for you. Stay with us to the end, because what happens to Clara Whitmore is the kind of thing that changes how you see people forever. And if this story moves you, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss. What comes next? We tell the stories the world forgets to honor. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Clara Whitmore had not expected warmth. She had not expected a man waiting at the station with flowers or kind words or even basic courtesy. She was 26 years old, and she understood, better than most women her age, what the words arranged marriage actually meant when they appeared in a letter from a father who had 4 daughters and not enough money to feed all of them through another winter. What she had not expected was the letter being thrown at her feet in the dirt. She had read enough of her father's correspondence over the years. She was the one who wrote most of his letters for him. Since his hands shook badly now, and his eyes weren't what they used to be, to know that whatever Ellison Whitmore had written to Gideon Hawthorne about his 3rd daughter was not flattering. Her father was a practical man. Practical men described things the way a livestock trader described cattle: weight, temperament, usefulness, value. She knew he had described her size. She knew because she had been described that way her entire life, and her father had never once thought of it as cruelty. To him it was simply information. What she hadn't known was that Gideon Hawthorne would choose to weaponize that information in front of an audience on the first day she arrived. The wagon driver who had brought her from Millhaven Station said nothing as he unloaded her 2 cases and set them in the dust. He was a hired man, and hired men knew better than to speak when the boss was in a mood. Climbed back up to his seat, clicked his tongue at the horses, and left without meeting her eyes. Clara stood alone in front of the main house. It was a substantial building. She could see that immediately. 2 stories, good timber, a wide porch that ran the length of the front face. Someone had built this place with intention and money, and it had been well maintained. The land around it stretched in every direction in that particular way of the Western Territories, where the sky seemed to be trying to flatten everything beneath it. 12 men stood near the fence line, some leaning, some just watching. They had clearly been working before the wagon arrived, and had stopped because something more interesting was happening. Gideon Hawthorne stood on the porch steps. He was taller than she'd imagined from the one brief letter he'd sent, with the kind of build that came from actual work rather than performance. Dark hair, sun-weathered face, jaw set like he'd already decided how this conversation was going to end before it started. He had read the letter from her father. That much was clear. He had read it, and whatever it said had put an expression on his face that sat somewhere between displeasure and something uglier, the look of a man who felt he had been deceived, even if no promise had ever been made. "You're smaller than I expected," one of the cowboys near the fence said under his breath. His companion snorted. Clara heard it. She was standing 15 feet away, and the air was still, and there was nothing to absorb the sound. She had spent her entire life hearing comments like that, or the opposite of that comment, depending on the room. She had learned very young that her body was public property in other people's minds. They discussed it the way they discussed weather, openly, without apology, as though she were not standing right there, hearing every word. She picked up her 2 suitcases herself because no one moved to help her. "Sst, you'll stay in the East Room," Gideon said, turning back toward the house. "Meals are at 6, noon, and 6. You'll be expected at all 3. Margaret will show you the house." He didn't ask if she was tired. He didn't ask about her journey. He had already gone back inside by the time she reached the bottom porch step. She stood there for a moment, both cases in her hands, looking at the door that had just closed. She had known this would be hard. She had told herself on the long train ride west, and then the longer wagon ride after that she would not expect kindness. She would expect work, and she would do the work, and eventually the work would speak for itself. She had not quite prepared for having a letter thrown at her feet in front of an audience. But she was still standing, both cases still in her hands. The afternoon light falling across the porch, she went inside. Margaret turned out to be 63 years old, heavy-set herself, with a face that had been weathered into something close to permanence. She had worked at Hawthorne Ranch for 11 years, and she had seen 4 different housekeepers come and go. And she had the particular economy of movement that came from a person who had learned not to waste energy on things that wouldn't last. She showed Clara the East Room adequate, clean, a single window facing the morning, and then the kitchen, the larder, the storage rooms, and the backyard where the kitchen garden had been. Had been was the operative phrase. The garden was dead. Not recently dead in the way of something that had been neglected across an entire season. The beds were choked with dry weeds, the stakes still standing where something had once been trained to climb them, the soil cracked and pale. "Who was managing the kitchen?" Clara asked. "I was," Margaret said, without any particular defensiveness in her voice. "Along with everything else, there's no other house staff. Was a girl who came in 3 days a week from town, but she stopped coming after her family moved south last spring. So you've been doing the house and the kitchen and the garden alone, and the mending and the accounts for the household supplies." Margaret paused. "Mr. Hawthorne doesn't notice those things." Clara looked at the dead garden for a long moment. What did the kitchen garden used to grow? Margaret looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since they'd met. Tomatoes, beans, squash, some herbs, onions. "What's the soil like underneath all that?" "Good," Margaret said slowly. "It's good soil. The water table's not deep here. Things grow well if somebody tends them." Clara nodded. She set down the mental calculation she'd started making about the garden and tucked it away. There was no point starting on it today. Today she needed to understand the kitchen first. She was not a fast rider. She was not the strongest woman who had ever walked through a door. She had been told these things so many times, in so many ways, that she'd stopped registering them the way you stop registering a clock ticking in a familiar room. She knew what she was not. She also knew what she was. She could cook, not in the apologetic, dutiful way of a woman who did it because it was expected. She cooked the way some people played music, with a particular understanding of how things worked together, what a dish needed, what it was trying to become. Her mother had taught her before she died, and before that her grandmother had taught her mother. And somewhere in that chain of women passing knowledge forward, there was a kind of intelligence that didn't announce itself, but was unmistakable once you tasted the result. She opened the larder and took stock. It was not well organized, and it was not well stocked, but there was more to work with than she'd expected. Salt pork, a barrel of flour, dried beans, cornmeal, some root vegetables going soft in the corner, oil, lard, a small quantity of actual coffee, real coffee, which surprised her. She started mentally rearranging what she could do with what was there. Behind her, Margaret said, "Supper's usually whatever's simplest. The men don't expect much." Clara turned around. "What do they get now?" "Beans mostly. Salt pork. Cornbread when there's time. Sometimes just bread." Clara looked at the woman for a moment. "How long has it been that way?" Margaret shrugged, but her eyes said something. Her shrug was trying to cover. "Long enough." The first supper Clara cooked at Hawthorne Ranch was not a triumph. She had not expected it to be. She had 3 hours and limited supplies and no clear understanding yet of how many men she was feeding or what the actual timing of their return from the range would be. She made a thick bean soup with the softening vegetables and the salt pork, seasoned carefully with what she found in the spice cabinet, which was depleted but not empty, and she made cornbread with a handful of dried sage crumbled in, because sage grew wild around here, and she'd seen it at the garden's edge, still stubbornly alive even in the dead beds. When the men came in, they didn't say anything about the food. They ate fast, the way men eat when eating is refueling rather than pleasure, and they cleared what was in front of them. One of the younger cowboys she'd learn later, his name was Pell, maybe 19, gap between his 2 front teeth, looked up from his bowl and said, "There's sage in this." "There is," Clara said. He didn't say anything else, but he didn't look away either, and she noticed he finished every drop. Gideon ate at the far end of the table, away from the men. He said nothing about the meal. He said nothing to Clara at all. She cleared the table herself because there was no one else to do it. In the kitchen, washing the bowls alone, she thought about the letter that was still folded in her coat pocket upstairs. She had not read it since she'd packed her bags in Ohio, but she had understood its general content from her father's careful avoidance of her eyes in the weeks before she'd left. She thought about throwing it in the fire. She thought about reading it. She thought about neither, and went to bed. The second week was harder than the first. It was not built for ranch physical labor. She knew this, and she didn't pretend otherwise, but she tried to understand the rhythm of the place, its working hours, its patterns, what it needed from a person stationed in the house. She asked Margaret questions. She watched which supplies ran out fastest. She listened to the complaints the ranch hands made to each other when they didn't know she was nearby, which were mostly about small indignities, torn gear, blisters, a horse with a shoe that needed attention, a man named Sutton, who apparently made more work for everyone around him. She did not yet understand all the ways the ranch was struggling. She understood the kitchen. She understood the house. The larger picture was still assembling itself. What she understood clearly was that Gideon Hawthorne resented her presence. He was not cruel in any dramatic fashion. He didn't shout. He didn't throw anything else. He simply moved through the house as though she occupied a slightly different plane of existence, not invisible exactly, but not quite real either. He spoke to her when necessary in the brief transactional language of a man who had decided something and found no reason to revisit it. She caught him looking at her once, Tuesdays after she arrived, across the kitchen while she was making biscuits. He was standing in the doorway, and for a moment she thought he was going to say something. His expression had shifted into something she couldn't entirely read, not contempt, not the cold assessment of the first day, something more complicated than either. Then he turned and walked back outside. She pushed the biscuit dough with more force than she needed to. She was not surprised by his behavior. She had understood the situation before she'd got on the train. This was a business arrangement between 2 men, her father and this stranger, and she was the commodity being transferred. She had no illusions about what Gideon had wanted when he'd placed the arrangement, someone to run the household, someone competent and available and not a problem. He had received her instead, and she understood that, from his perspective, she was a problem. What she refused to do was agree with him. On the 9th day, Sutton, the man whose name she'd heard in complaints, walked into the kitchen while she was preparing the midday meal and helped himself to a biscuit from the tray she'd set aside for serving. She watched him take it. He was a large man, maybe 40, with the particular kind of confidence that came from never having been told no in a way that stuck. He chewed and looked her over in that flat, evaluating way she'd already learned to recognize as the ranch's default expression for her. "Heard you used to cook for a boarding house," he said. "I cooked for my family," she said, "and helped a neighbor who ran a small dining room." "Huh." He took another biscuit. "You know how to ride?" "I can ride," she said. Not well, he smiled at that, not a kind smile. Ranch wife who can't ride. That's going to be something to watch. Clara turned back to the pot she was stirring. There's a wooden spoon in that drawer if you'd like to make yourself useful while you're standing in my kitchen." Sutton stared at her for a moment. Then he laughed, genuinely laughed, surprised out of his sneer, and walked back out without taking a third biscuit. She wasn't sure what to make of that. She wasn't sure it meant anything. But she noticed that at the midday meal, Sutton sat closer to the center of the table than usual, and when she set down the bowl of beans with the dried herbs she'd found in the back of the cabinet, he was the first one to reach for it. Small things. She was learning to watch for small things. The letter from her father burned in her coat pocket, not literally, but with the particular weight of something that wants to be dealt with. She read it the night of the 9th day. It said what she'd known it would say. It described her as capable and good-natured and healthy, and then it described her physical appearances in the frank, unsentimental terms of a man who thought he was doing a buyer a service by being accurate. It mentioned her size twice. It mentioned that she was a good cook, and that she had managed his household since her mother's passing, and that she had no real complaints to speak of. No real complaints. As if she were a horse with good teeth. There was one line at the bottom that she hadn't expected. "She has more in her than people see. I hope you'll give her the chance to show you." She folded the letter again and put it back in her pocket. She didn't know whether to be angry at her father or grateful to him. Both feelings sat inside her at the same time and didn't resolve, and she let them sit because she had work to do in the morning, and unresolved feelings had never stopped her before. She looked out the window of the east room at the dark shape of the dead garden below. Tomorrow, she thought. I'll start with the garden tomorrow. She didn't know yet that starting the garden would set in motion something she could not have planned and could not have predicted, something that would change what Hawthorne Ranch meant to the entire territory. She only knew that the soil was good, that things grew well if somebody tended them. The garden did not come back easily. Clara had known it wouldn't. Good soil didn't mean cooperative soil, and the beds had been abandoned long enough that the weeds had established themselves with the particular stubbornness of things that have gone unchallenged. She worked on it in the early mornings, before the household woke and before the ranch hands came in for breakfast, because those were the only hours that belonged to no one, and therefore could belong to her. She used a hand spade she found rusting in the lean-to behind the kitchen and sharpened it herself against a whetstone she located in the toolbox. Margaret pointed her toward. She pulled weeds by hand where the spade was too blunt an instrument. Palms blistered on the third morning. She wrapped them in strips of cloth cut from an old pillowcase and kept going. Margaret watched from the kitchen window without comment for the first 2 days. On the third day, she came outside with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Clara without speaking. Clara took it. They stood there together in the early light, looking at the beds she'd cleared so far. "You know anything about soil amendments?" Clara asked. "Some," Margaret said. "There's a compost pile behind the barn the men don't bother with. Been building up for years. Is it ready? Parts of it." Clara drank her coffee. "I'll need help getting it to the beds. It'll be too heavy to move alone." Margaret looked at her with the flat, assessing expression that Clara was beginning to understand was just how the woman looked when she was thinking. "I'll ask Pell. He's the least useless of the young ones." Pell turned out to be willing, in that particular way of very young men who haven't yet learned to perform reluctance. He showed up the next morning with a wheelbarrow before Clara had even finished her coffee, and he moved 3 loads of compost to the cleared beds without being asked twice. He didn't talk much, which Clara appreciated, but he asked 2 questions that told her he was actually paying attention to what she was doing, where she wanted the heavy material, and whether she planned to section the beds or plant them open. "Section them," she said. "Easier to manage what's growing where." He nodded, like that made sense to him, and went back for another load. She wasn't naive enough to think one helpful teenager meant anything about her standing at the ranch, but she filed it away. The first real confrontation with Gideon didn't happen in the house. It happened at the fence line, 10 days after she arrived. when she walked out toward the range to ask him something about the kitchen supply budget and found him mid-argument with two of the senior ranch hands about the timing of the next cattle drive. She stopped a distance away and waited, because interrupting that kind of conversation was not something she intended to do. But Sutton was there too, standing slightly to the side, and he noticed her and said, loud enough to carry, "Boss's wife needs something, looks like." Gideon turned. The irritation on his face from the previous argument didn't clear it, just redirected. "What is it?" he said. Not a question. A door cracked open the minimum width. "The household supply budget," Clara said. "I need to understand what I have to work with for the kitchen before I make decisions about what to plant and what to purchase. Margaret knows the budget. Margaret told me you handle the allocation. She hasn't had a clear number in 4 months." Something shifted in his expression, not guilt exactly, but the look of a man who has let something slip and doesn't want to admit it. "I'll speak to Margaret." "I'm asking you now," Clara said. "I'd like a clear number so I can plan accordingly." The two ranch hands had gone very still. In that way, people go still when they're watching something they find interesting and don't want to interrupt. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. The same look from the kitchen doorway, complicated, unreadable, slightly irritated by its own complexity. He named a figure. It was not generous, but it was real, and it was clear, and it was more than she'd spent in a week in Ohio. "Thank you," she said, and walked back to the house. Behind her, she heard Sutton say something low, and then a short silence, and then Gideon's voice saying, "Get back to work." She ordered seeds that afternoon, writing out the list carefully in the letter she'd composed to the merchant in Millhaven. Tomatoes, beans, squash, 3 varieties of herb, onions, a small quantity of corn because the soil near the fence seemed right for it. She also ordered cinnamon and vanilla and a small quantity of dried fruit because she had a plan that wasn't about the garden. Margaret watched her write the letter. "Dried fruit's expensive." "I know. He won't see the point. He doesn't have to yet," Clara said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Then, what are you making?" "Pie," Clara said. "Eventually. But first I need to make something they want to come back for. They come back because it's their job." "That's not what I mean," Clara said. She sealed the letter and set it aside for the next supply run. The thing she had noticed, the thing that nobody else seemed to notice because they were too close to it or too accustomed to it, was that the men who worked Hawthorne Ranch were tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. They moved through their days with a flatness that she recognized, not from her own life, but in the years after her mother died, when the house had become functional rather than alive. Things got done. Nothing felt worth doing. She didn't know yet what had caused it at the ranch. She didn't know the history well enough, but she could see the symptom clearly, and she understood from her own experience that real food that took effort and care, was one of the few things that could cut through that particular kind of numbness and remind a person that someone somewhere had thought they were worth the trouble. It sounded simple. She knew it wasn't. The seeds arrived 11 days later on the supply wagon, along with the spices she'd ordered, and, unexpectedly, a small wheel of cheese that the merchant had added to the order, with a note saying it had come in from back east, and he thought the Hawthorne account might want first pick. Clara paid for the cheese out of the kitchen budget without hesitation. That night she made something she hadn't made since Ohio, a proper supper, not just a filling meal. She roasted the root vegetables she'd been watching, go soft for 2 weeks, finally pushing them past the point of simple soup, and she seasoned them properly and let them caramelize. And she made a pan gravy with the drippings from the salt pork and the last of the dried herbs from the cabinet. And she cut the cheese and set it out with the bread she'd baked that afternoon. Bread that had risen correctly this time, because she'd finally figured out that the kitchen ran cooler than she was used to, and the dough needed longer. The men came in from a difficult day. She'd heard from Margaret that a section of and fence had collapsed, and they'd spent 6 hours in the cold rounding up cattle that had scattered, and they sat down at the table with the particular silence of people too tired to speak. Food stopped them, not in a dramatic way. Nobody said anything, but she watched them slow down, which was the thing that mattered. Watched them stop eating like machines, refueling, and start eating like people who were tasting something. Pell looked up at some point and glanced at the plate in front of him as though he was surprised to find it interesting. One of the older men, a quiet ranch hand named Deaver, who she'd barely exchanged 10 words with, leaned slightly forward over his plate in a way that said something without words. Sutton ate 2 full portions. Gideon ate at his usual remove at the far end of the table, but she noticed he didn't stand up and leave the moment he was done, which was what he normally did. He sat for extra 3 minutes, and she caught him looking at the bread she'd left in the center of the table, and then he took a second piece. He didn't say anything about the food. He didn't say anything to her at all. Took the second piece of bread, and she saw it, and she didn't make anything of it out loud because making something of it would have been the wrong move. She cleared the table and washed the dishes and went to bed and thought about what she was going to plant in the garden sections. Pell had helped her prepare. The garden started producing 6 weeks later, which was faster than she'd expected, given the late start and the thin spring they were having. The tomato seedlings she'd started in pots inside the kitchen window were small but stubborn, and the beans she'd direct seeded had come up in clean rows, and the herbs were already usable. She'd cut back the volunteer sage that had survived the neglected winter, and it had responded by coming in thick. She was crouched in the bean rows one morning, pulling the weeds that came back no matter how many times you pulled them, when she heard boots on the dry ground behind her. She didn't turn around immediately. She'd learned in 6 weeks that turning around immediately made people think you'd been waiting for them. The tomatoes are inside still, Gideon said. The nights are too cold. Another 2 weeks, maybe 3. A pause. Deaver said you've been out here before sunup every day. It needs tending. Another pause. Longer. She kept pulling weeds, not because she was making a point, but because the weeds needed pulling, and stopping in the middle of a row bothered her. The men are eating better, he said finally. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him, standing a few feet away with his arms crossed, which was his default posture, and his face had the particular expression she'd started to think of as his honest face, the one that appeared when he'd said something he hadn't fully planned to say and hadn't yet figured out how to qualify. I know, she said. I wasn't sure. He stopped. Started again. I didn't expect the kitchen to change that fast. I had a lot to work with that wasn't being used. He looked at the garden beds. My wife planted those originally. 8 years ago. Clara hadn't known that. Margaret had never mentioned a previous wife. I didn't know. She died 4 years after we came out here. He said it the way people say hard things when they've said them so many times, that the words have worn down to their essential shape, not without feeling, but with the feeling compressed into something small and dense. The garden went after that. I didn't know, but he kept it up. Clara looked at the beds she'd reclaimed and thought about the dead weeds she'd pulled out by the root, the dry stakes still standing from someone else's climbing beans, the soil that had been good all along underneath the neglect. I'll keep it up, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't fully identify. Discomfort, maybe, or something adjacent to gratitude that he didn't know how to carry. He nodded once and walked away. She turned back to the weeds. Her hands were shaking slightly, which surprised her. She hadn't expected that conversation, and she hadn't expected it to land the way it did, not warmly, not with any kind of resolution, but with the particular weight of 2 people accidentally touching something real. She pulled the next weed and the next. It was Margaret who told her about the water. 6 weeks after Clara arrived, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, with a cup of coffee going cold between them, Margaret said, "You know about the creek situation?" Clara said she didn't. Harlan Mead owns the land north of us. He dammed the upper creek 3 years ago. We share water rights with 4 other ranches in this valley, and Mead controls more of the flow than he's legally supposed to. Gideon's fought it twice in Millhaven Court and lost both times. Clara thought about the creek she'd seen riding the wagon in wide enough to be meaningful, positioned well for the valley's needs. How does Meade win? He's got money and he's got the right lawyer, and he's been in this county longer than anyone else. Margaret wrapped both hands around her cup. The other ranches should fight alongside Gideon. They've got the same problem. But Meade's been careful to offer small advantages to each of them separately. A little extra flow here, a price break on shared grazing there, and it keeps them from standing together. Clara absorbed this, so they're being managed. Divided, Margaret said, and he's good at it. Does Gideon talk to the other ranchers? Margaret's expression shifted into something between irony and weariness. Gideon talks to other ranchers the way he talks to most people, which is to say he doesn't, particularly he's not. She paused. He doesn't build things with people easily. He builds things alone. Clara thought about that. She thought about the men around the supper table who had started incrementally to look like people rather than machines. She thought about Pell showing up with a wheelbarrow. She thought about Deaver leaning over his plate. The other ranchers, she said. Do their families eat? Margaret stared at her. What? I mean, do their wives cook? Do their ranch hands eat meals together? Is there any shared table in this valley, or does everyone eat separately in their own buildings? Margaret thought about it. Separately. Always. There's no common ground between the ranches. Some bad history. What kind of bad history? Land disputes. Cattle strayed over wrong fences. A fistfight at the Millhaven General Store 7 years back that people apparently haven't forgiven. Margaret shook her head slightly. It's not dramatic. It's just the way grudges build out here. Slowly. And then they're just the way things are. Clara was quiet for a while. I want to have people over, she said. Margaret set down her cup. I beg your pardon, neighbors, the other ranch families. I want to invite them here for a meal. Gideon won't. I know he won't like it, Clara said. I'm not asking his permission. I'm telling you what I'm planning so you can help me plan it properly. Margaret looked at her for a long moment with an expression that Clara was starting to recognize as the one she wore when she'd shifted her position on something and wasn't ready to admit it yet. You'd need to make enough for the nearest ranch is the Holloways, 3 families, about 14 people if you count the hands. I can make enough for 14. And the Vance spread. How many? 8. Maybe 10. Fine. Margaret picked up her coffee cup, found it cold, and set it back down. You know what happened the last time people from those ranches were in the same room? What happened? 2 men nearly broke each other's jaws over a property line that had been resolved by a surveyor 2 years prior. That was 7 years ago, Clara said. People get tired of being angry. Not always. Sometimes, Clara said. Sometimes they just need somewhere to put it down. She brought it to Gideon 3 days later, not as a request but as an announcement with room for input, which was a distinction she'd been thinking about carefully. I want to invite the Holloways and the Vances for supper, she said, 2 weeks from Saturday. I'll handle the cooking and the preparation. I'm not asking you to do anything except be present. He looked at her from across the desk in the room he used as an office, where she'd found him going over supply ledgers. He had the pen still in his hand. The Holloways and the Vances don't get along with each other, he said. I know. And Ted Vance and I haven't spoken directly since the Millhaven thing. I know that too. He set the pen down. Then why? Because the water problem isn't going to solve itself, she said. And you've tried to solve it alone twice and lost. Maybe the answer isn't a better argument in court. Maybe the answer is different people standing behind the argument. He was very still. You've been thinking about this for a while, he said. Margaret told me about the creek. I've been thinking about it since. Margaret talks too much. Margaret talks the right amount, Clara said. You just don't listen. The silence that followed was the kind that could go in several directions. She waited to see which one it would take. Gideon picked up his pen. He turned it between his fingers, once, twice. He set it down again. 2 weeks from Saturday, he said. Yes. And you're handling the cooking. Yes. You'll need the supply budget adjusted. I made a list, she said, and set the paper on the desk. He looked at it. She watched his eyes move down the page, and she watched the slight tightening around his jaw that was either calculation or resistance, or both, and then she watched it ease slightly. "This is a lot of cinnamon," he said. "I'm making apple cake." He looked up at her. For a second, just a second, something crossed his face that was almost amusement. Almost. It didn't quite get there, but it was in the neighborhood. "Fine," he said, and signed the adjusted budget at the bottom of her list. The Saturday arrived with a kind of weather that felt like a personal insult, overcast and cold and threatening rain that never quite came, just hung in the air as a promise of misery that kept refreshing itself. Clara had been up since 4. Margaret had been up since 4:30, which was the closest thing to a declaration of partnership she'd offered, and Pell had come in at 5:30 saying he didn't have anything particular to do, and was there anything to carry. Clara had learned was his way of asking to help, without having to say he was asking to help. The Holloways arrived. First a family that turned out to be 3 generations, which she hadn't expected. The elder Holloway was a man in his 70s who moved carefully and watched everything. His son ran the actual ranch operation, a quiet man named James, who shook hands with Gideon without making it into a performance. James's wife, a woman named Ruth, who looked at Clara's kitchen with the frank appreciation of someone who understood what a kitchen represented, said, "It smells incredible. What are you making?" "Roasted chicken," Clara said, "and a beef stew that's been going since yesterday. And the cake." Ruth said, "You started the stew yesterday?" "You have to," Clara said. "If you start it the day you serve it, people can taste the shortcut." Ruth looked at her in a way that said this was a woman who had also started stews the day before and knew exactly what Clara meant. The Vances arrived 40 minutes late, which created a tension Clara had anticipated. Ted Vance was a large man with a face that was accustomed to being unhappy and had settled into that expression permanently. He shook Gideon's hand with the minimal investment of a man who had agreed to be somewhere without having agreed to enjoy it. His wife, a small, brisk woman named Dora, looked at the Holloways across the room and then looked at Clara and said, "I wasn't sure we'd both be here. I invited everyone." Clara said, "Can I get you something to drink?" Dora looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed short and genuine. "Yes," she said, "please." The supper itself was not smooth. These were not people accustomed to being in the same room, and the early part of the meal had the particular texture of people being careful conversations that stayed on safe ground, silences that nobody wanted to own. James Holloway and Ted Vance made eye contact twice before either of them spoke directly to the other. But food does something to the careful management of distance between people, gives them something to attend to that isn't each other, and in attending to it, they lower their guard, and in lowering their guard, they sometimes, not always, but sometimes remember that they're all just tired people sitting around a table. The elder Holloway, whose name was Calvin, asked Clara at some point in the middle of the second course, where she'd learned to cook like this. "My mother," she said, "and my grandmother before her. There's a recipe book. What's in it?" "Everything they knew," Clara said. "The family's memory, really, written down so it doesn't get lost." Calvin Holloway was quiet for a moment. "My wife kept a book like that," he said. "Couldn't find it after she passed. Always wondered if it was somewhere in the house. We didn't look carefully enough." The table had gone slightly quieter around that exchange. Clara looked at the old man and said, "Sometimes those things turn up when you're not looking for them anymore." He nodded once, slowly, and she could see something shift in him, not grief, exactly, but the release of something that had been held. Across the table, Ruth Holloway touched her husband's arm briefly. Ted Vance was watching Calvin Holloway with an expression that had nothing to do with old arguments or property lines. It was later, after the apple cake had been served and the table had loosened into the particular ease that comes after good food, and enough time that Gideon brought up the water. He didn't make a speech. He wasn't built for speeches. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without decoration. Meade's been taking more than his share for 3 years. Fought it twice and lost. I think the only way to fight it differently is to fight it together. all 3 ranches making the same claim at once. Ted Vance was quiet for a moment. My lawyer said your lawyer and my lawyer are both in Millhaven. Gideon said, and Meade's lawyer is from the capital, and that's been the problem. We need someone from outside the county. James Holloway leaned forward slightly. There's a man in Redfield, handles water rights cases. Won 3 in a row against larger landowners. Gideon looked at him. You know him? Of him, James said. We could find out more. Ted Vance had his arms crossed. It was the posture of a man who was being pulled towards something he'd decided against and was trying to figure out whether his decision still made sense. Clara watched him from the kitchen doorway where she'd stopped with a coffee pot, not wanting to interrupt, but not wanting to leave. What would it cost? Vance said finally. To bring someone from Redfield. Split 3 ways, manageable, Gideon said. Alone, I can't do it again. Table was quiet. Outside, the cold that had been threatening all day finally made itself felt. The wind had picked up, and the sound of it moved around the house like something looking for a way in. Ted Vance uncrossed his arms. All right, he said. I'm listening. Clara set the coffee pot down on the sideboard and went back into the kitchen. Margaret was standing at the wash basin, and she looked up when Clara came in and didn't say anything, but her expression was the closest thing to satisfied that Clara had ever seen on her face. Cake was good, Margaret said. The cake was fine, Clara said. No, Margaret said quietly, not looking up from the basin. It was good. The weeks after the supper had the texture of something building, not quickly, not dramatically, but building the way the garden was building, incrementally, below the surface, in ways that weren't visible yet, but were real. James Holloway sent a letter to the man in Redfield. Gideon wrote his own letter outlining the water situation in clear terms. Ted Vance, to Clara's surprise, contributed a hand-drawn map of the creek's original documented course, which he'd apparently had in his possession for 2 years and hadn't thought to share. Why didn't you show this to anyone before? Gideon asked when it arrived. She overheard his response. Vance had come himself to deliver it, and Vance said, because there wasn't anyone to show it to. You and I weren't talking. There was a silence in the hallway where this exchange was happening, and then Gideon said, we're talking now. Table that night, he told Clara about the map. He had come into the kitchen after supper. It was new he'd started doing it occasionally. Not with anything particular to say, just occupying the same space while she cleaned up. She'd stopped reading anything into it and started accepting it as a habit, like how some people pace when they're thinking. The map changes things, he said. It shows exactly where the original survey put the creek's division. Meade's been operating outside those boundaries since he dammed it. You didn't have it before? I had testimony. This is documentation. He leaned against the doorframe. Documentation is different. Clara dried her hands on a cloth and thought about her father writing that she had more in her than people saw. She thought about the dead garden and the good soil underneath. She thought about Margaret saying he builds things alone, said, with enough weight to be both description and criticism. The other ranches, she said, the ones further out. Meade affects them too, doesn't he? Gideon looked at her. Talk to them. Some of them. Not recently. Clara folded the dishcloth. There's the Esterbrook place to the south, and the Malone family. Margaret mentioned them. And the family that came out from Tennessee 2 years ago. I forget their name. Duffy, he said. Duffy, she said. Are they managing the water problem any better than we are? He was quiet. Invite them to supper, Clara said. He looked at her for a long moment. You want to feed the entire valley, he said. I want the entire valley to know that there's a table here, she said. The rest follows from that. He pushed off from the door frame. He looked like a man who was working out the arithmetic of something and didn't enjoy where the numbers were landing. Not because they were wrong, but because they required him to revise a calculation he'd been running for years. Esterbrook Place is 8 miles out, he said. I know. That's a long way to come for supper. People come a long way for something that matters, she said. He looked at her, and this time the complicated expression on his face was different from the ones she'd cataloged so far. It had something new in it, not warmth exactly, but the precursor to warmth, The place you have to get to before warmth is possible. Smoke, which is the recognition that someone in front of you is capable of surprising you. He said, I'll send word. He left the kitchen, and Clara stood in the quiet of it, the last of the supper dishes still in the rack, the smell of the apple wood she'd burned in the stove still in the air, and she felt something she hadn't felt since she'd stepped off the wagon in the dust, with her 2 suitcases and a letter at her feet. Not triumph. Nothing as clean as that. Something more like the first real indication, after weeks of working in cold ground, that something alive was growing. The Esterbrooks came on a Thursday. Clara hadn't expected Thursday. Gideon had sent word suggesting Saturday, the same day the previous supper had been. But Owen Esterbrook sent back a note saying Thursday worked better for his operation, and he hoped that wasn't an inconvenience. The note had the careful formality of a man who wasn't sure of his welcome and was trying to leave himself a graceful exit if things went badly. Clara wrote back and said Thursday was perfectly fine, and she meant it, because the day of the week didn't matter to her. What mattered was who sat down. Owen Esterbrook turned out to be a man of about 50 with a quiet wife named Helen and 3 sons, the oldest of whom was maybe 22 and the youngest maybe 15. They arrived in a wagon that had seen better years, the wood gray and dry, one of the wheel's spokes wrapped with wire where it had cracked. Clara noticed the wagon without commenting on it, and she noticed Helen Esterbrook noticing it. And she looked away first, so the woman wouldn't have to manage any embarrassment about it. The Duffy family came an hour later, the Tennessee family Gideon had named, and they turned out to be a husband and wife, both young, mid-20s maybe, with a baby on the wife's hip and the particular combination of exhaustion and determination that Clara recognized as the face of people in their first hard years of trying to build something from nothing. The wife's name was Alma, and she apologized immediately for the baby, who was making sounds. Don't apologize, Clara said. Sit down. Let me hold her if you need your hands. Alma looked at her with the expression of a woman who had not expected that offer and didn't know what to do with it. She handed the baby over after a moment's hesitation, and Clara held her against her shoulder, and the baby grabbed a fistful of Clara's hair and pulled, and Clara winced and extracted herself, without making a production of it, and kept moving toward the kitchen. Margaret appeared in the doorway with the expression she wore when she was watching something she found interesting, which was starting to become a frequent expression. Owen Esterbrook's oldest boy is looking at your garden like it owes him money, Margaret said. Look, Clara said. Send him out if he wants to help with the tables. She had decided to eat outside. This time the weather had finally broken into something approaching warmth, and the yard behind the house was large enough, and eating outside changed the feeling of a gathering in ways she'd noticed her whole life. Inside, people were guests in someone else's house. Outside, everyone was just people in the same place under the same sky. Pell had helped her drag the long table from the barn out to the yard, and they'd set it up with 2 more smaller tables borrowed from the bunkhouse at the ends, making a shape that wasn't quite a proper table, but could seat everyone. The oldest Esterbrook boy, whose name turned out to be Nathan, appeared around the corner of the house while she was thinking about the setup and asked without preamble if there was anything to move. Those 2 benches, Clara said, pointing. And there's a crate near the kitchen door that needs to come this way. He moved them without further conversation, which she appreciated. The Malones arrived last, just as the food was almost ready. A family that turned out to be larger than Margaret had suggested. 8 people if you counted the elderly grandmother, who moved with a walking stick and a look of permanent judgment that Claire so suspected was just her face in repose. Her name was Edna, and she sat down at the head of the mismatched table without being asked and looked at the assessment around her, with the frank assessment of a woman who had hosted a great many gatherings and was evaluating this one on its merits. You're the Hawthorne wife, she said to Clara, when Clara came to set a water pitcher nearby. I am, Clara said. Heard you've been feeding people. I have. Edna looked at her directly. My daughter-in-law feeds people too. She's not half as good as she thinks she is. Clara looked at the older woman and said, Most of us aren't. Edna was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Sit down next to me at supper. I want to talk to you about something." Clara said she would. The supper itself was larger and louder than the first one, which was both good and complicated. More people meant more noise, and more noise meant less of the careful, diplomatic quiet that had marked the Holloway Vance evening. Children ran between the tables. The Estabrook boys talked too loud. One of the Malone men, a brother-in-law whose name Clara didn't catch, made a comment about water that landed wrong with Owen Estabrook, and for a moment the table stiffened. But Alma Duffy, the young woman from Tennessee who had been mostly quiet all evening, said clearly from the middle of the table, "My husband walked the creek last spring, and he said, 'The flow's been wrong as long as we've been here. We just didn't know who to tell.'" The table went quiet in a different way. "Wrong how?" James Holloway asked. Alma looked at her husband, whose name was Garrett, and Garrett leaned forward in that deliberate way of young men who have been listening carefully and are choosing their moment carefully. The flow pattern from the upper creek should follow the original watershed. We could see from the lay of the land where it used to run. It doesn't run that way now. It cuts east before it should, which is exactly where Meade's Dam redirects it. Owen Estabrook said, "You know about watershed reading?" "My father did," Garrett said. "He surveyed back in Tennessee before we came out, taught me what to look for." Gideon, who had been eating with his usual quietness at the side of the table rather than the far end, looked at Garrett Duffy with an expression Clara recognized as the one he wore when he was recalculating something. "Could you document what you observed?" "In writing, with the specific locations." "Already did," Garrett said. "I kept a survey log from the day we arrived." Habit. The table was very quiet. Ted Vance, who had come again, Clara had invited him specifically, and he'd come without needing to be asked twice. She noted, said, "That's 3 pieces of documentation now. The original survey map, the creek documentation, and a survey log from a man who knows watershed reading." The Redfield lawyer wrote back. James Holloway said, "He's interested." Owen Estabrook put down his fork. "Who's the Redfield lawyer?" Gideon explained. Clara watched Owen Estabrook's face go through several calculations and settle on something that looked like cautious interest. She watched Edna Malone watching the same conversation from the head of the table with the focused attention of a woman who had seen how these things went and was deciding which direction this particular one was heading. "What does it cost?" Owen said. "Split how many ways now?" 5 ranches, Gideon said. Clara watched the arithmetic move around the table. At the head of it, Edna Malone tapped her walking stick against the ground once, not loudly, but with the precision of a woman who had a point to make. "Harlan Meade has been working this valley for 20 years, on the assumption that no one would cooperate long enough to stop him," she said. "He's probably right that we wouldn't have until now." She looked directly at Clara. "This was your idea." It wasn't a question. "The supper was my idea," Clara said. "The rest belongs to everyone here." Edna looked at her for another moment. "Same thing," she said, and picked up her fork. Later, after the families had gone and the tables had been pushed back and Pell had helped carry the benches back to the bunkhouse, Clara sat at the kitchen table with her shoes off and her feet aching from 8 hours of standing. Margaret set a cup of tea in front of her and sat down across from her, which was something Margaret almost never did. "Edna Malone likes you," Margaret said. "Edna Malone likes the idea of what I'm doing," Clara said. "That's different." "Not much different with Edna." Clara wrapped her hands around the teacup. Her palms still had callous lines from the garden work, which she'd stopped noticing until moments like this, when she was still enough to look at her own hands. "Duffy Boy's survey log," she said. "That's the piece I didn't expect." "Nobody expected that," Margaret said, including Gideon. He was surprised. He was more than surprised. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I've worked here 11 years. I've watched him fight this water problem alone, twice, and lose, and come home from Millhaven each time, looking like a man who'd been told something he already knew." She wrapped her own hands around her cup. "Tonight was the first time I've seen him look like he might actually win." Clara was quiet. "He'll give you credit for it," Margaret said. Eventually, he's slow about that kind of thing. But he gets there. I'm not doing it for credit, Clara said. I know, Margaret said. That's why he'll give it. The thing about building something across people who didn't naturally cooperate was that it required constant tending the same way the garden did, the same way any living thing did. You couldn't gather them together twice and assume the connection would hold on its own. Clara understood this from a bone-deep place that had nothing to do with strategy. It was just how people worked. So she kept cooking. She varied what she made, because the same meal twice was a message about what you thought of someone's expectations, and she wanted to send a different message. She made things that took planning dishes, that required 2 days of preparation, or ingredients ordered from Millhaven a week in advance, or techniques her grandmother had written in the recipe book in the careful, slightly formal handwriting of a woman who wanted to be understood by whoever came after. She started inviting individuals, not just families. She invited James Holloway alone, one afternoon, for coffee, because she'd noticed at the supper that he had questions he wasn't asking in front of the full group, and over coffee at the kitchen table, he told her what she'd suspected, that his father, Calvin, was not well. The church's management was increasingly on his shoulders alone, and that he wasn't sure his brother, who'd gone east for school, would come back. He might not have to, Clara said. If the water case settles well, the land value in this valley goes up. That changes your options. James looked at her. I hadn't thought that far. Start thinking that far, she said. She invited Alma Duffy, who came with the baby and without Garrett, and they spent 2 hours in the kitchen, Clara teaching Alma the sage biscuit recipe, because Alma had asked about it at the supper, and Alma teaching Clara a Tennessee-style corn preparation that was different from anything in the recipe book, and that Clara made that night for supper, and Pell ate 3 portions of. She invited Owen Esterbrook's wife, Helen, who came alone and sat in the kitchen for 30 minutes, barely speaking, before she finally said, I don't know what you're doing here, but whatever it is, Owen hasn't been this hopeful about the ranch since we came out. The water case, Clara started. Not the water case, Helen said. He came home from that supper, and he said she stopped, and her expression shifted into something private and careful. He said it felt like someone finally saw that this valley was worth saving. Not just their own piece of it, all of it. Clara thought about the dead garden and the good soil. She thought about things that had been neglected for long enough that people forgot they had been alive. It is worth saving, she said. Helen looked at her with the same expression Alma had worn when she'd offered to hold the baby, something like surprise at finding generosity in an unexpected place. Thank you, she said, for the supper, and the other thing, whatever you'd call it. Clara didn't name it. She refilled Helen's coffee and let it stay unnamed, because naming it would make it a thing, and things could be argued against in ways that the unnamed couldn't. It was in the middle of all this forward motion that the first piece of the other problem arrived. A man came to the ranch on a Wednesday, mid-morning, while Gideon was out on the range and Clara was in the garden, staking the tomatoes that had finally gone into the ground. He came on a horse that was too good for the clothes he was wearing, which was the first thing she noticed. The second thing she noticed was that he took in the ranch the way you take in a place you've been told about, rather than a place you're visiting for the first time, with a kind of confirming attention, not curious but checking. He asked for Gideon by name when Pell came out to meet him. He's not here, Pell said. Back around noon. The man said he'd wait. He dismounted and tied his horse and stood near the fence with his hat in his hands, in the posture of someone who'd been taught to look patient. Clara finished the row she was staking and came around the side of the house. She looked at the man, and the man looked at her, and she said, "Can I help you?" "Just here to see Mr. Hawthorne," he said. His voice was pleasantly neutral in the way of someone who had practiced being pleasant. "I'm Mrs. Hawthorne," she said. "What's the nature of your business?" Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his face, a small recalibration. "It's regarding some properties in the valley. I represent a purchasing interest that's looking at several parcels." "Whose purchasing interest?" "I'm not at liberty to name the client directly," he said, with a smile that was professionally warm and informationally empty. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then I'd say we have about the same amount to offer each other, she said pleasantly, and went back inside. She told Gideon about it when he came in at noon. He listened to her description of the man the good horse, the checked posture, the careful vagueness about who he represented, and his expressions went to a flat alertness she hadn't seen before. What did he look like exactly? He said. She described him. Medium height, brown coat, mid-40s, a way of holding his hat with both hands that struck her as practiced. Did he give a name? Farwell, she said. Or he said Farwell. I wouldn't stake anything on it being his real name. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He didn't wait. He waited until you were 20 minutes out, and then left, Clara said. Pell watched him go. He headed north. North was where Harlan Meade's property was. Gideon sat very still at the kitchen table. Clara had set soup in front of him, and he hadn't touched it. Case, he said. Yes, she said. If Meade knows we're moving toward it. He probably has known for a while, Clara said. A man who's managed this valley for 20 years has eyes in it. Gideon looked at her. You're not surprised. I'm not surprised, she said. Are you? He pushed back from the table slightly. He was doing the calculation she could see him doing whenever the picture changed, reassessing, reorganizing, looking for the new edges of the problem. He'll try to buy. The ranches that are least stable financially. If he can pick up enough parcels, the water rights case changes because the distribution of affected landowners changes. Who's least stable? Clara asked. He looked at her again, and she could see the slight resistance in him, not because he didn't trust her, but because he had spent so long keeping the details of his world inside his own head that sharing them still required conscious effort. Duffy, he said. They're newest. Their land is good, but they're 2 bad seasons away from not making it. Esterbrook's not far behind. That's why Owen came to the supper. He needed something to change. Clara thought about Alma Duffy and the baby and the Tennessee corn preparation and the way Garrett had leaned forward at the table with his survey log and the particular pride of a young man who'd been invisible until someone finally needed what he knew. Then we need to move faster, she said. The lawyer in Redfield. Not just the lawyer, she said. The ranches. If Meade is moving to buy, then the best way to stop it is to make sure those families know what they'd be losing. Not just the water case. Everything that comes after it. Gideon looked at the soup that had gone cold in front of him. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who was hungry but had run out of space in his head for physical needs. You want to have another supper, he said. Not a supper, Clara said. Something bigger. She had been thinking about it since the man on the horse had recalibrated his expression when she'd said she was Mrs. Hawthorne. That recalibration had told her something. He had come here expecting a ranch with a particular kind of center to it, and he had found something different than he'd expected, and the difference had registered as something worth noting. The ranch had been a single point. It was becoming a network, and a network was much harder to pick apart piece by piece than a collection of isolated points. I want to make it regular, she said. Not one-time suppers for specific purposes. A regular gathering. Every 2 weeks, rotating between the ranches so it's not all on us. Shared table, shared planning. The Holloways and the Vances barely managed to sit in the same room. They managed fine last time, Clara said. Better than fine. They shared a lawyer. He was quiet. Edna Malone said something to me at the Last Supper, Clara said. She said Meade has built his position on the assumption that no one here would cooperate long enough to stop him. Not a guess. That's an observation from a woman who's been watching this valley for 30 years. If she can see it, then Meade knows it too. It's his actual strategy. Gideon looked at her fully then, not with the complicated expression she'd catalogued and studied, but with something clearer. A look of someone seeing a thing directly, rather than managing their feelings about seeing it. You've been thinking about Meade since the man on the horse, he said. I've been thinking about Meade since Margaret told me about the creek, she said honestly. The supper was already part of it. I just didn't say so. A silence that was not uncomfortable. You should have said so, he said. You wouldn't have agreed to it as a tactic, she said. You'd have wanted to handle Meade directly. But the supper wasn't a tactic. It was also real. I wanted those people together because they belong together. The Meade part is secondary. He absorbed this. But it's there. It's there, she said. The two things don't cancel each other out. He got up from the table and went to the window that faced the range, the posture he defaulted to, when he was thinking through something that required looking at something that wasn't the inside of a room. Clara waited. I'll write to the Redfield lawyer today, he said, and I'll write to James Holloway about the Farwell visit. And the Duffys, she said. They need to know what they might be approached with. And the Duffys, he agreed. He turned back from the window, the regular gathering rotating ranches. That'll take coordination. I'll coordinate it, she said. You're already managing the kitchen, the garden, the household supplies, the correspondence. I know, she said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said quietly. I want to. He stood there for a moment, and the expression on his face was the one she'd first seen at the garden, the complicated one, but closer to its resolution now than it had been then. Something working its way toward being said. Clara, he said, and then stopped. She waited. I owe you an apology, he said, for the day you arrived. The letter in the dirt, the 12 men watching. Read it. She had not expected him to say it. She had catalogued it and put it away and built her life here on top of it, and she had not expected him to surface it directly. You do, she said. He nodded once. He wasn't going to elaborate. She could see that he wasn't a man who elaborated, and she didn't need elaboration. She needed the acknowledgement. All right, she said. Not it's fine. Not I forgive you. Not any of the smoothing phrases she'd been offered in her life when people wanted her to make something easier for them. Just all right, she'd received the apology. That was what it was. He went back to his office to write the letters. She made fresh soup. The Farwell man came back the following week, and this time Gideon was there. Clara stayed in the house but left the office window open, not deliberately, or at least she told herself it wasn't deliberate. She could hear the conversation from the kitchen where she was working, though not every word. Farwell had a smooth way of talking. She could hear that. The kind of talk that dressed itself up as practical and neighborly while it was actually doing something else. She caught the phrase consolidation of regional landholdings and the phrase transitional market, something about fair assessments, all of which were the vocabulary of a man who had been trained to make an offer sound like information. She could not hear Gideon's responses as clearly, but she heard the tone, the flat brevity of a man who is being polite in the way of someone choosing not to do the other thing. Farwell left after 20 minutes. His horse headed north again. Gideon came into the kitchen. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and she looked at him. He's buying for Meade, he said. I know. He offered to buy us out at a price that would have looked generous 3 years ago and looks exactly like what it is now. Did you say no directly? I said I wasn't interested in selling, and I'd pass along his offer to the neighboring ranches so they could make their own decisions. Clara set down what she was doing. He won't like that. No, Gideon said. He won't. It means Meade knows we're talking to each other. It means Meade knows we're talking to each other, Gideon confirmed, which means whatever he's going to do next, he'll do faster. Clara looked at the window, which was still open, through which the late afternoon light was coming at the angle it came. At this time of year, laying long and warm across the kitchen floor. Outside, the tomatoes were finely staked and growing, and the bean rows were thick, and the herbs she'd cut back in the spring were full and healthy. And the whole garden that had been dead when she arrived was alive now in ways that were visible from the road if you drove past. Things grew well if somebody tended them. Then we move faster too, she said. The regular gatherings began, and they were not smooth, and they were not simple. And there were 3 separate arguments across 3 separate meetings that Clara had to manage without letting it look like she was managing anything, which was the particular difficulty of the thing you couldn't be seen to be holding it together, because the moment people felt held together by someone external, they stopped doing it themselves. At the Esterbrook Ranch, the second gathering, Nathan Esterbrook and one of the Malone sons got into an argument about a fence line that had apparently been quietly festering for 2 years, and it got loud enough that Helen Estabrook came into the yard with a look on her face that said she'd been afraid of exactly this. Clara was carrying a pot from the wagon they'd brought the food in, and she set it down and walked directly into the middle of the argument and said, "I need both of you to help me get this pot inside. It's heavier than I can manage." It wasn't. She could manage it fine. But both young men stopped shouting and looked at her with the slightly deflated expression of people who'd been interrupted mid-anger by something too mundane to argue against. And they carried the pot inside, and by the time they came back out, the temperature of the yard had dropped enough that the thing didn't reignite. Later, Helen Estabrook found Clara in the kitchen of her own house and said quietly, "I don't know how you did that." "I didn't do anything," Clara said. "You did. They made the choice," Clara said. "I just gave them somewhere to put it down." The water case moved forward in its slow, documentary way letters to the Redfield lawyer. The lawyer writing back with questions. Garrett Duffy transcribing sections of his survey log. James Holloway organizing the paperwork that had accumulated across 3 ranches into something that could be submitted formally. Ted Vance contributed money toward the lawyer's fee before he was asked. Gideon reported these developments to Clara in the evenings, standing in the kitchen in the habit he'd developed, and she listened and asked questions, and he answered them with the growing ease of a man who was discovering that thinking out loud with another person didn't automatically make him weaker. She didn't know exactly when it had changed, when the space between them and the house had gone from cold distance to something that was at least habitable and warming. It hadn't been a single moment. It had been accumulated small ones. The second piece of bread at supper, the conversation at the garden, the apology for the letter, the evenings in the kitchen, the letters written and answered, the decisions made across the kitchen table, with 2 cups of coffee going cold while they talked. One evening, Pell knocked on the kitchen doorway. He always knocked, even though the door was open, which was one of the things she'd come to like about him. And he said that a rider had come in from the North Road with a letter for Mr. Hawthorne, and he'd said it was urgent. Gideon read the letter at the kitchen table with Clara across from him. His face went very still in the way it went, still when something bad landed, and he was processing it before he let himself react. "What is it?" she said. He set the letter down and pushed it across the table to her. It was from Edna Malone. Harlan Meade had approached the Malone family with an offer to buy their land. He had done it quietly, going directly to Edna's son rather than to the family as a whole. He had offered a price that her son had found tempting enough that he'd told Meade he'd consider it without consulting the rest of the family. Edna had found out when she'd overheard part of a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear, and she had written to Clara because she trusted Clara more than she trusted the formal chain of anyone else. "He is moving to isolate us one by one," Edna had written. "The way he always has. I am old, and I know exactly what I am seeing. If your gatherings are going to mean anything, they need to mean something now." Clara read it twice. She set it down and looked at Gideon. "How many of the other ranches do you think he's approached?" she said. "If he went to the Malones," Gideon said, "he's gone to everyone he thinks is reachable." "We need to call a meeting," she said. "Not a supper, a meeting. All 5 ranches together now." He looked at her. "It'll be messy. It'll be honest," she said, "which is what it needs to be." He nodded. "I'll write out myself tonight. And I'll write to Edna," Clara said, "and tell her to bring her son." She picked up a pen and pulled paper toward her, and across the table, Gideon was already reaching for his hat. And outside the window the valley spread in the direction of all 5 ranches, and all the people in them, who were being managed by a man who had spent 20 years betting on their separateness. He was about to find out that the bet had changed. Gideon rode out that same evening and didn't come back until past midnight. Clara heard the horse in the yard and heard him come through the back door, and she was still at the kitchen table because she hadn't been able to sleep. And she'd told herself she wasn't waiting up, but the lamp was lit and the coffee pot was on the stove, and she'd been sitting there for 3 hours, so the distinction was mostly technical. He came in and looked at her, and looked at the coffee pot, and sat down without speaking, which meant the rides had not gone cleanly. She poured him a cup and sat back down across from him. "The Duffys first," he said. Garrett knew Meade had sent someone. "A man came by last week with an offer. Garrett didn't tell me because he was embarrassed. He said he'd been tempted. They've had a hard spring. The baby's been sick. He was tempted, and he's ashamed of it." "Being tempted isn't a crime," Clara said. "No, but not telling us was a problem." Gideon wrapped his hands around the cup. "He's not going to sell." He said that clearly, but he needed to say the rest of it first. "Good that he said it," Clara said. "Better to have it out. Esterbrook's." He paused. "Owen was already awake when I got there. He'd been sitting in his kitchen, same as you. He'd received a visit from Farwell 3 days ago, and he'd told no one, including Helen. He was processing it alone. Did he say what the offer was? Enough to make their situation comfortable and no more. Meade knows the exact pressure point for each family." Gideon's voice had the flatness of someone describing something that made them quietly furious. "He's done this before, somewhere else. You don't get that precise by accident. And the Malones? Edna's son is named William. He's 43 years old and he runs the ranch. And he has been running it under the weight of his mother, watching every decision he makes for 11 years, and he is tired in a way that has nothing to do with the work." Gideon looked at his coffee. Meade's man found that. Made the offer directly to William when Edna wasn't present. Framed it as William finally being able to make a decision that was his alone. Clara was quiet for a moment. "That's not accidental either." "No, is William going to hold?" "I don't know." Gideon said, and the honesty of it, the admission that he didn't know, said plainly, without the performance of certainty she'd seen men use to cover. Uncertainty was one of the moments she'd started to recognize as Gideon at his truest. He said what he didn't know. It had taken her a while to understand that about him, because he said so little that each thing he said carried more weight than most men's words. Edna has more influence over him than he'd admit. If she stands firm, he stands firm. If she wavers. "She won't waver," Clara said. "She wrote to me instead of handling it quietly." That was a choice. He looked at her. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He nodded slowly. "Holloway's were the clearest. James said he'd received an approach, but Calvin told the man to leave before he'd finished his sentence. Calvin Holloway has been watching Meade for 20 years, and he doesn't have enough years left in him to pretend to think about it. So everyone's been approached," Clara said. "Everyone. And everyone's being asked to hold." "Yes." She got up and refilled his cup even though it wasn't empty, because she needed to do something with her hands. "The meeting tomorrow. What do you need it to be?" "Thought about it. I need everyone in the same room, knowing that everyone else has been approached. Right now, each family is carrying the approach privately, like it's something to be ashamed of. Once they know, Meade did the same thing to all of them. It changes the meaning of it. It's not a private temptation anymore. It's a strategy being run against all of them equally. And they can be angry at the strategy instead of ashamed of themselves," Clara said. Yes, he looked at her. Exactly that. She sat back down. Outside the kitchen window, the night was fully dark, and the wind had died, and the valley was as quiet as it got, which was never entirely quiet. There were always sounds from the barn, from the range, from the particular orchestra of nighttime that she'd learned to read as the ranch's version of silence. "I'll make food for tomorrow," she said. "Not a supper, just enough. People think better when they're not hungry." He almost smiled. Not quite, but the muscles around his eyes shifted in a way she'd learned to read. "You think of everything as a meal." "I think of everything as what people need to do the thing in front of them," she said. "Sometimes that's food. Sometimes it's a letter. Sometimes it's someone willing to say a hard thing out loud." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara," he said, and this time he didn't stop. "When I brought you out here, what I expected, and what you've..." He stopped again, but differently than before. Not because he didn't know what he wanted to say, because he was trying to say it accurately, which was different from not knowing. I underestimated you in a way that I'm still understanding the full extent of. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight. This man who threw letters in the dirt and built ranches alone, and talked to almost no one, and had spent 11 years letting a garden die because he didn't know how to tend what his wife had left behind. I know, she said. I'm trying to do better. I know that too, she said. They sat in a quiet kitchen for a while after that, not talking. And it wasn't uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had arrived at a place that didn't need filling. The meeting happened the next morning in the barn at Hawthorne Ranch because it was the largest enclosed space available. And Clara had cleared a section near the front and set up planks across sawhorses to make a table that wasn't really a table, but functioned as one. She'd made biscuits before dawn and a large pot of coffee, and she set both at the end of the plank table without ceremony. Because the point wasn't ceremony. The point was that people had something to do with their hands while they were being honest with each other. All 5 ranch families came, every one of them. The Holloways arrived first, Calvin in the wagon and James driving, and Calvin lowered himself to a seat near the front of the assembled space, with the deliberate economy of a man who had learned to conserve. He looked at Clara when she brought him coffee and said, "You're the one who called this." Gideon. "Called it," she said. Calvin looked at her in the way of a man who had been alive long enough to know the difference between who signs a letter and who writes it. He said nothing more about it and drank his coffee. The Vances came with Ted leading, and Ted shook Gideon's hand, and then found a spot near the wall and stood there with his arms crossed in his habitual posture. But she'd learned to read Ted Vance's crossed arms as thinking rather than resistance. The Duffys came with the baby, Alma carrying her against her shoulder, and Garrett carrying a leather-bound notebook that Clara recognized as his survey log. He'd brought it without being asked, which told her something about where his head was. The Esterbrooks were next, Owen and Helen and Nathan. Nathan standing in the way of tall young men who were trying to take up less space than they actually occupied. And finally the Maloneys, a group of 7, which Clara hadn't expected, because she'd thought it would be Edna and William, and William's wife. But William had brought his 2 brothers as well. And Edna arrived last of all with her walking stick, and the look of permanent judgment that Clara had learned was actually the look of a woman who was paying attention. William Malone looked the way Garrett Duffy had looked. The night before, the particular look of a man carrying something he was about to set down in public for the first time, and not entirely sure how it would land. Gideon let everyone settle. He was not comfortable in front of groups. Clara could see that, but he was honest, and his honesty had a quality that commanded attention without requiring performance. He stood at the front of the cleared barn space and looked at the assembled families and said, "Harlan Meade sent men to all of us, not just us, every ranch in this valley." He made each offer privately, and I think deliberately privately, because a private offer feels like a personal choice. I want to put it on the table that it wasn't personal. It was a method. The barn went very quiet. Ted Vance's arms uncrossed. Owen Esterbrook looked at the floor and then looked up, and the expression on his face when he looked up was different from the one he'd brought in, something looser. It was William Malone who spoke first, which surprised Clara. He said, "From the middle of the Malone group, he came to me directly, when my mother wasn't present. He said it to the room, not to anyone specific. I think he knew she'd say no immediately, and he wanted to see if I'd say yes on my own." Edna, seated nearby, didn't look at her son. She looked at the middle distance with an expression Clara couldn't fully read. "He had a price for every one of us," William continued. "Exactly the right price. Not enough to make you comfortable forever, just enough to make your specific problem go away. Mine was different from what he offered Owen, I'd bet." "Did he offer you?" Owen asked, directly and without hostility. William told him. Owen's expression confirmed it was different from his own offer. "Mine was different again," Garrett Duffy said, from across the room. He had the survey log in both hands, and he was holding it with the grip of someone who needed something physical to hold on to. He knew about the baby being sick. I don't know how he knew, but he mentioned it not directly, but he mentioned it. The room was very still. James Holloway said quietly, "He has eyes in the valley." "He's always had eyes in the valley," Calvin said, from his seat near the front. His voice was old and dry and entirely certain. "He had eyes in this valley when I first came out here 30 years ago. A man like Meade doesn't run a strategy like this without information. He knows who's struggling, and he knows how, and he times his approaches to those struggles." "That's not legal," Nathan Estabrook said, from near the wall. "Knowing things isn't illegal," Calvin said. "Using them to make offers isn't illegal. Doing to the water is illegal, and that's the fight we have." The room shifted back to the core of it, the water. The case, the Redfield lawyer. James Holloway laid out where the legal effort stood, which was further along than most of the room knew, because information had been traveling through some channels and not others. Garrett Duffy put his survey log on the plank table and opened it to the sections he'd been transcribing, and Owen Estabrook and Ted Vance both leaned in to look at it, which was a thing Clara marked, because 3 months ago those two men had not leaned toward anything together. The Redfield lawyer had responded. He had reviewed what they'd sent him, and he believed there was a case, a real case, not a long-shot case. He needed one additional piece of documentation, the original territorial survey of the creek bed, which should be registered in the county land office in Millhaven if it hadn't been tampered with. "Has anyone checked the land office?" Clara asked from near the barn door, where she'd been standing quietly. Heads turned. She hadn't spoken yet in the meeting, and she hadn't planned to. This was Gideon's meeting and the ranchers' meeting, and she knew the value of speaking from a particular kind of presence rather than the front of a room. "Not recently," James said. "The county registrar is a man named Ferris," Calvin said. "He's been in that office for 12 years, he's not." He paused. "He's not Meade's man exactly, but he's careful about not making enemies of people with money. Would he give access to the survey records if someone came with a clear legal purpose and a lawyer's request in writing?" Clara asked. "Possibly," Calvin said. "With enough pressure. The Redfield lawyer can write the request," Gideon said. "Take it to Millhaven myself." "Take James with you," Clara said. "Two landowners presenting the request is different from one." Gideon looked at her. James Holloway looked at her. James said, "I'll go." Ted Vance said, from near the wall, "I'll go too. If 3 is more than 2. The room had a different quality now than it had when everyone walked in. Not warm exactly, because these were people with old grudges and different interests, and genuine differences that one barn meeting wouldn't dissolve. But it had the quality of people who had stopped pretending to be separate from each other's problems. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the thing Meade was most afraid of, and Clara suspected most of them were beginning to understand that. Edna Malone stood up from her seat, slowly, with the walking stick, and the room gave her the attention that 70-plus years in a difficult place had earned. She looked around at the assembled families, and she said, "I want to say something that nobody here is going to enjoy hearing." The barn was entirely still. "We have been allowing one man to run this valley from the outsides because we couldn't manage to stand in the same room as each other. It's on all of us. Not just Meade." She looked at Ted Vance, and then at the Holloways, and then at Owen Estabrook. "Every grudge you've carried, every fence dispute, everything you let fester because it was easier to be angry than to work it out." She tapped the stick once against the barn floor. "Meade didn't create the separateness. We did, he just knew how to use it." Nobody argued. William Malone was looking at his mother with an expression Clara hadn't seen on him before, something that was the sun underneath the man who ran the ranch. Something younger and more honest. "What do we do now then?" he said. "Not to the room. To Edna. We stop letting him use it," she said. She sat back down. Clara made more coffee after that, and people drank it, and the meeting broke apart slowly, the way meetings do when they've actually done something, not all at once. People drifting into smaller conversations, the specifics getting worked out between individuals while the larger frame held. She was refilling Owen Estabrook's cup when he said quietly, so only she could hear, "Helen told me what you said to her. When she came here, Clara waited, that the valley was worth saving, all of it. He looked into his cup. I needed to hear that. I think I'd stopped believing it. You came to the supper, Clara said. That was believing it. Barely, he said. I came because Helen made me. She was more sure than I was. He drifted away to find James Holloway, and Clara stood for a moment in the busy barn with the coffee pot in her hand, watching the room Garrett Duffy showing his survey log to Ted Vance, Nathan Esterbrook talking to the younger Malone brothers with the awkwardness of young men who'd been adversaries and were figuring out they didn't have to be. Calvin Holloway sitting quietly and watching everything the way he watched everything, with the still attention of someone who was storing it. Gideon appeared beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there looking at the same room. The Redfield lawyer needs the county survey, he said finally. I know, Millhaven is a day's ride, I know. Ferris might not cooperate. I know that too, she said. But 3 landowners with a lawyer's written request is different from one man who's already lost twice in the county court. Ferris knows which way this valley is blowing, now if he's been watching. Gideon was quiet for a moment. You think news of the meeting gets back to Meade. I think news of everything gets back to Meade, she said, which means news of this will too, which might be useful. He looked at her sideways. You want him to know? I want him to know exactly what he's facing, she said. Not to scare him into retreating, he won't retreat. He doesn't work that way. But to make sure his next move is a reaction to reality rather than his assumptions about us. His assumptions were built on the old version of this valley. She looked around the barn at the new version of it, imperfect and unresolved, and still carrying its old wounds but standing in the same room anyway. Let him react to this, she said. Gideon rode to Millhaven 4 days later, with James Holloway and Ted Vance, carrying the Redfield lawyer's written request and the combined documentation they'd assembled the original survey map Ted had contributed, Garrett's Creek observation log, the affidavits Gideon had finally gathered from 3 of the 5 ranches describing the diminished water flow to their operations. Clara stayed at the ranch and minded the work that needed minding, which was considerable. She processed the first major harvest from the kitchen garden more than she'd expected, the beans especially, which had produced in thick abundance and needed to be preserved immediately. She spent 2 days doing it with Margaret's help, the kind of work that was both satisfying and exhausting, standing over a hot stove while the summer pressed in from outside. Pell helped with the heavier work, hauling water and moving crates, and at some point during the second afternoon, he said, while they were working side by side at the kitchen table, sorting beans, "You think they'll get the survey records?" "Yes," she said. "How do you know?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know. But Ferris has been in that office for 12 years, and he knows how the law is supposed to work, even if he's been careful about not enforcing it against Meade. 3 landowners and a legitimate legal request that puts Ferris in a position where denying them creates a problem for him too. He's calculating the same thing everyone calculates. Which side is safer? Pell sorted beans in silence for a moment, and now the safer side is ours. That's the idea, she said. He was quiet again, and then Mrs. Hawthorne. Before you came, he stopped. She waited, the way she waited for things that needed space. The ranch was different, he said. I don't know how to say it exactly. It was like everyone was just doing the job. And the job was fine. The job got done. But it was just he searched for the word. Flat. It was flat. She looked at the beans in her hands and thought about her father's house after her mother died, and the particular flatness of it, the way a place felt when the person who had animated it was gone. I know what flat feels like, she said. It's not flat anymore, he said. She didn't say anything back. She just kept sorting beans, and the afternoon pressed on around them, and outside the garden moved in a small breeze, and the ranch that had been one thing was becoming another. Gideon returned from Millhaven on the 3rd day. Clara was in the garden when she heard the horses on the road, and she straightened and shielded her eyes and watched the 3 riders come up the track, Gideon, James, Ted, and she could read the outcome from the way they were riding before anyone said a word. Not triumphant, not defeated, something in between which meant complicated. She went inside and made coffee and waited. Gideon came in first. He sat down at the kitchen table and pulled a folded document from his coat and laid it flat on the table and smoothed it with his palm. Ferris gave us access, he said, with conditions. What conditions? The request had to be logged formally. Now on the county record that a legal inquiry was made regarding the creek survey documentation, which means Meade will know about it officially through the county record, not just through his informants. That's all right, Clara said. There's more. He looked at the document. When James found the original survey record in the file, there were notations on it, added after the original filing in different ink, different handwriting. Clara stared at him. Someone altered the record, he said. Added a marginal note that attempts to redraw the creek's boundary line. It's not legally effective. It's not a filed amendment. It's a handwritten note in a margin, but it was clearly intended to muddy the documentation if anyone came looking. Ferris let you take it? Clara said. James made a certified copy. Ferris certified it himself. He looked. Gideon paused. He looked like a man who'd been waiting for someone to find that notation and was relieved to finally have the decision about what to do with it taken off his hands. Clara sat down across from him. The notation proves someone tampered with the record. The Redfield lawyer thinks it actually strengthens the case. If Meade's operation went to the trouble of altering a county document, that suggests consciousness of a legal vulnerability that they knew the original record didn't support what they were doing. Can the tampering be traced? The lawyer thinks so. The handwriting can be compared. The ink can be dated. It takes time, but it's possible. She was quiet, processing. Outside, she could hear James and Ted Vance talking in the yard, the easy back and forth of men who'd ridden 3 days together and come out of it knowing each other better than they'd gone in. Meade is going to move fast now, she said. Yes, the Redfield lawyer. Can he move fast? He said he's filing within the week, once we send him the certified copy. Gideon looked at her. He also said something else. He said a case with 5 plaintiff ranches and documented water rights violations. And evidence of record tampering is not just a water rights case anymore. He said this has the attention of the Territorial Land Authority. Clara absorbed this, which means it's bigger than the county court, which means it's outside Meade's influence network, Gideon said. County court he owns. The Territorial Authority, he doesn't. She let out a breath. When did it become this? It always was this, Gideon said. We just didn't have enough pieces assembled to see the whole shape of it. She thought about Edna Malone saying he has done this before, somewhere else. She thought about the man on the horse, with the good horse and the checked posture, arriving to survey what he thought he was taking. What does Meade do when he loses a legal case? She said. Gideon's expression went somewhere careful. I've been asking myself that, and I don't know, he said. Which bothers me. Should, she said. A man who's been doing this for 20 years and losing for the first time, the loss doesn't end his need. It just redirects his method. You think he'll do something outside the legal fight. I think we should be prepared for it, she said. He looked at the certified copy of the survey record on the kitchen table between them, the document that had been sitting in a county file with a tampered margin, waiting for someone to come looking. What do you want to do? He said. The question was simple and direct, and she understood what it meant. Not what do you want me to do, but what do you want to do? As if her answer was the one that mattered in this particular moment. She thought about it honestly. Tell the other ranches everything, she said. Tonight, if possible. Meade will know about the certified copy within days through the county record. We should not let that information reach him before it reaches our own people. Gideon was already standing up. I'll ride to the Maloney's first, he said. Closest. And I'll write to Garrett Duffy and Helen Esterbrook tonight, so they have it in writing, Clara said. Something in writing means something you can hold. He stopped at the door and looked back at her. In the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window, he looked tired, genuinely tired. The tiredness of a man who had been fighting a long fight and was starting to see the end of it, which was its own kind of exhaustion, because the end of a long fight was not a rest. It was a different kind of effort. Clara, he said. She looked up from the paper she'd already pulled toward her. "I'm glad you didn't go home," he said. She held the pen and looked at him standing in the kitchen doorway of the house that was becoming something different from what it had been when she'd arrived, not fixed, not finished, nothing like that, but different, alive in a different way. "I never thought about going home," she said. "I was already home." Something crossed his face that she would think about for a long time afterward, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the opposite of dramatic, just real. The honest face, the one she'd catalogued early, but carrying something new now that it hadn't carried before. He nodded once and went to get his horse. The letter from the Redfield lawyer arrived 2 weeks later, confirming that the case had been formally filed with the Territorial Land Authority and that a hearing date had been set for 11 weeks out. 5 plaintiff ranches, 1 consolidated claim, water rights violations documented across 4 years, evidence of record, tampering submitted as supplementary material. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table, with Margaret standing over her shoulder, which was something Margaret would never have done 4 months ago. 11 weeks, Margaret said. 11 weeks, Clara confirmed. What happens in 11 weeks? "We make our case to people who aren't in Meade's pocket," Clara said, "and he makes his case. And the Territorial Authority decides. And if they decide wrong?" Clara folded the letter carefully. "They won't. You can't know that." "No," she agreed. "But I know what we're bringing into that room. And I know what he's bringing. And I know which one of us built it by working with people, and which one built it by working against them." She set the letter in the center of the table. "That matters." "Not always, but it matters." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Changed since you got here." Clara looked at her. "I don't think so." "You've gotten harder," Margaret said, not critically, observationally. "Not mean harder. Just you know how to hold a thing now without letting it shake you." Clara thought about the letter thrown in the dirt. She thought about the 12 men watching. She thought about the dead garden and the blistered palms and the night she'd read her father's description of her and then folded the letter back up and put it in her pocket and gone to sleep, because the morning would need her functional. She thought about 2 cups of coffee in the early morning light and a woman standing beside her at the garden without being asked. "I learned it from someone," she said, and Margaret looked away and said nothing, which was the closest she'd ever gotten to, accepting a compliment, and Clara let it rest there where it was. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was fully alive, tomatoes red and heavy on their stakes, beans threading up the strings Pell had helped her rig, the herbs thick and fragrant, the volunteer sage still running along the far edge, impossible to discourage, alive whether anyone tended it or not. 11 weeks, and Harlan Meade would find out that the valley he'd spent 20 years managing was no longer manageable in the way he'd built his life around. And if he had another move to make before then, Clara intended to be ready for it. Meade's next move came in the 7th week, 4 weeks before the territorial hearing. Didn't come as another purchase offer. Clara had been right about that a man who understood that the legal ground had shifted wouldn't waste time on offers that were no longer going to land. What he did instead was quieter and more corrosive, the way water damage was quiet. And corrosive, you didn't see it happening, only the result after it had already done its work. The first sign was a rumor that reached Clara through Helen Estabrook, who'd heard it from a woman in Millhaven who ran the dry goods store. The rumor said that the 5 ranch water case was fraudulent, that the documentation had been fabricated, that Garrett Duffy's survey log was the work of a man with no credentials and no standing, that the certified copy of the creek survey had been manipulated by the ranchers themselves before it was submitted. Clara heard this from Helen on a Wednesday morning, when Helen wrote out specifically to tell her, which was itself a thing. Clara noted a woman who 4 months ago had barely known her name riding 8 miles to bring her information. "How widely is it spreading?" Clara asked. "Wide enough," Helen said. "The Millhaven paper printed a letter," anonymous, but with specific enough detail to seem credible, Clara said. "Yes." Clara thought about the man on the horse, with the checked posture, and the good horse, and the professionally warm smile. Farwell, or whatever his name was. A man built for this kind of work, not rough work, not confrontation, but the quiet dismantling of things through information and doubt. The other ranches know? Clara asked. Gideon is riding to tell them this morning, Helen said. He asked me to come to you first. Clara looked at her. Why? Helen looked back at her steadily. Because he said you'd know what to do about it. The fact of that, Gideon saying that, to Helen without hedging, landed with a weight that Clara didn't have time to sit with. The Redfield lawyer, she said. He needs to know today. The rumor needs to be addressed before the territorial authority hears it from another direction. Gideon's writing him after the rides. Not after, Clara said. Now the rides can wait an hour. She was already moving toward the house. Come inside. I'll write the letter, and you can take it back to Millhaven when you go. The post goes out this afternoon. Helen followed her inside without hesitation. The letter to the Redfield lawyer went out that day. The lawyer whose name was Aldous Crane, a name Clara had learned to trust across months of correspondence. Without ever meeting, the man wrote back within 4 days, which was faster than she'd expected. His letter was composed with the particular economy of someone who had seen this specific move before and had been waiting for it. He had already filed a preemptive response with the territorial authority. He had anticipated exactly this kind of challenge credibility attacks on the documentation and on the plaintiff, and had prepared a packet that included Garrett Duffy's credentials, his father's survey, work back in Tennessee, certified by the Tennessee Land Authority, and a letter from the Millhaven County surveyor, not Ferris, a different man, a working surveyor confirming that the methodology in Garrett's Creek observation log was consistent with professional survey practice. Aldous Crane had also, quietly, hired someone to investigate the handwriting in the tampered margin of the county survey record. His letter informed them that the comparison was complete. The handwriting matched a clerk who had worked in the Millhaven land office for 2 years and had left that position, 8 months ago, to take a job at a land management company in the capital. Company in which Harlan Meade held a 40% interest. Clara read that section of the letter twice. Then she walked to Gideon's office and set the letter on his desk and stood back while he read it. When he finished, he looked up at her and said, "He's exposed." "Not completely," she said. "Not yet. But the thread is there and Crane is pulling it." The territorial authority, will they act on this before the hearing? Crane says they may open a separate inquiry into the record. Tampering. That's outside the water rights case. It's a criminal matter, potentially. Gideon sat back in his chair. He had the expression of a man watching something he'd fought for a long time finally begin to tip, and finding the tipping more complicated than he'd imagined, not less satisfying, but not simple either. Victory had texture when you'd been in a thing long enough. "Meade won't wait for the hearing," Gideon said. "No," Clara agreed. "He'll try something in the next 4 weeks." "Yes." "What?" She thought about everything she understood about Harlan Meade, assembled across months of watching his method from the outside the private offers, the targeted pressures, the information network, the altered record, the rumor campaign. He was a man who worked through proxies and indirection. He had never, as far as she could tell, done anything himself that could be directly traced to him. Everything went through intermediaries. "He'll try to break the coalition," she said. One more time, harder. "He knows the ranches are the foundation. If he can pull even one out before the hearing the Duffys, maybe they're still the most financially vulnerable, the case weakens." Garrett said he wouldn't sell. Garrett said he wouldn't sell when the case looked like it might win, Clara said. If Meade can make it look like it might not, if the rumors create enough doubt, the calculation changes. Gideon looked at her directly. "What do we do?" "We hold the table," she said, literally. "We call the gathering for next week instead of the week after. All 5 ranches. I want Aldous Crane's letter read aloud, in front of everyone, every piece of it, including the handwriting comparison. Once they hear it together, Meade's rumor campaign doesn't have anywhere to grow. And the Duffys specifically?" Clara had been thinking about this since Helen had told her about the rumor. She had been thinking about Alma and the baby and Garrett's survey log, and the particular way young people carried pride differently from older people, more exposed, more easily shamed by implication. "Let me talk to Alma," she said, before the gathering, alone. She rode to the Duffy place herself the next morning, early, before the heat built. It was a ride she hadn't made alone before, and the horse they gave her was not the easiest animal she'd ever been on. But she managed it, which she would not have been able to say when she'd arrived at Hawthorne Ranch 8 months ago. Alma was in the yard when she arrived, hanging laundry with the baby on a blanket nearby in a patch of shade. She looked up, and her expression cycled through surprise, and then something more guarded, and Clara understood the guardedness it meant the rumors had reached here, too. She dismounted and tied the horse and said, without preamble, "I'm not here, because we doubt Garrett." Alma's expression didn't fully clear. He hasn't been sleeping. Since the letter in the Millhaven paper. "I know," Clara said. "Can we sit?" They sat on the porch steps, the baby pulling herself along the blanket nearby in the determined way of a child on the edge of crawling. Clara told Alma about Aldous Crane's letter. All of it, the credentials verification, the handwriting comparison, the Meade connection to the clerk who had altered the record. She told it plainly, without trying to manage Alma's reaction. Alma listened with the focused stillness of a woman who had learned to parse information carefully because getting it wrong had consequences. When Clara finished, Alma was quiet for a moment. "He did it to discredit Garrett specifically," she said. "The rumor about the survey log. He didn't attack the other documentation the same way." "No," Clara said. "Garrett's the youngest, the newest, the least established. Meade calculated that attacking his credibility was the easiest pressure point." Alma's jaw tightened slightly. "He doesn't know Garrett." "No," Clara said. "He knows Garrett's situation. That's different." The baby made a sound of effort and triumph from the blanket, and both women looked at her. She had pulled herself another 6 inches and was investigating a small stone with the total concentration of someone encountering a remarkable discovery. Alma looked at her daughter for a moment and then looked back at Clara. "What do you need from us?" "Nothing except what you're already doing," Clara said. "Stay in. Come to the gathering next week. Let Garrett hear Crane's letter read aloud in a room with the other ranchers." "Why the room?" "Because doubt grows in isolation," Clara said. "It's a lot harder to doubt yourself when you can see that other people don't." Alma thought about this. She had the particular thoughtfulness of someone young enough that their opinions were still forming, and old enough to know it. "You came all the way out here just to tell me this." "Yes." "You could have sent a letter." "A letter isn't the same as a person," Clara said. Alma looked at her for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "The night Garrett told me he'd been tempted by Meade's offer, he couldn't look at me, like he'd done something wrong just by being tempted." She picked at a thread on her apron. "I didn't know what to say to him. I still don't, entirely. He needed something from me that I wasn't sure how to give." "What did he need?" "He needed me to not think less of him," Alma said. "I don't. But I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like I was just saying it." Clara thought about her father's letter. "She has more in her than people see. I hope you'll give her the chance to show you." The particular helplessness of someone who knows a true thing about another person and can't find the shape of the words to make it land. "You don't have to say it," Clara said. "You can show it. You came to the gathering. You brought him. You let him open the survey log in front of everyone." Saying it, Alma was quiet. "He did good work," Clara said. "The survey log is real. Crane's letter proves it. And the fact that Meade went after it specifically, that's actually proof that it mattered. You don't attack documentation that doesn't threaten you." Something shifted in Alma's face, a kind of settling, like a thing finding its right position. She nodded once slowly. "We'll be there," she said. Clara rode back to Hawthorne Ranch, with the morning heat building around her and the sound of the horses' hooves on the dry ground, and the valley stretched in every direction, the 5 ranches in it, invisible from the road, but present in the way of things you know are there even when you can't see them. The gathering the following week was different from every previous one. Clara could feel it when people arrived, the quality of how they came in, not the careful diplomatic performance of the early suppers, but something that had settled past performance into something more durable. The Malones arrived, and William Malone shook Gideon's hand and said, without preamble, "My mother told me last night that if I ever consider an offer from Meade's people again, without telling her first, she'll revise her opinion of my intelligence permanently." He said it with a dry humor that Clara had not heard from him before, and Gideon almost smiled. Garrett Duffy came in with his survey log under his arm, the way he'd done at every gathering since the barn meeting, and Clara watched him shake hands with Calvin Holloway, who held his hand a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and said, "Your father taught you well," in the voice of a man for whom that was not a small thing to say. Garrett looked at the old man and said, "Yes, sir," in a voice that was steadier than it would have been a month ago. She read Aldous Crane's letter aloud herself, because Gideon asked her to, and because she understood why she had a way of reading that didn't perform. That let the words be what they were without addition. She stood at the front of the assembled group in the barn and read it through, from the beginning, the credentials, the survey methodology confirmation, the handwriting analysis, the connection to Meade's Capital Company. The room was very quiet. She finished. Ted Vance said, "Into the quiet. He tampered with a county record. Not a civil matter." "No," she said. "Crane has already flagged it to the territorial authority as a separate matter from the water case. So he's facing two separate proceedings," James Holloway said. "Potentially." Owen Estabrook said, from near the back, "Is that why the rumors started?" He knew this was coming, and he was trying to undermine our credibility before it became public. Crane's interpretation, Clara said, and mine. The room absorbed this. Edna Malone said, from her usual seat he overreached. She said it without satisfaction, just as observation. Men like Meade overreach eventually, because the method that's worked for 20 years starts to feel like the only method. Tampered with a county record because it had always been easy to manage county records. He didn't account for someone coming with a lawyer's request and finding it. Calvin Holloway said he didn't account for someone coming at all. The two old people looked at each other, across the barn, with the recognition of people who had watched the same valley from different vantage points for a long time and had reached the same conclusion about what they were seizing. The territorial hearing was held in the county seat, which was a town called Harrow, a day and a half's ride from the valley. All 5 ranch families sent representatives. Some came in full. Some sent only the landholders, and Aldous Crane met them there. A smaller man than Clara had imagined from the letters, with precise handwriting that extended to his physical movements. Everything deliberate and economical. He shook hands with each representative in turn, and when he came to Clara he said, "Mrs. Hawthorne, the gatherings were your idea." "The gatherings were necessary," she said. "They were the difference," he said, simply, and moved on. The hearing lasted 2 days. Clara sat in the gallery with the other family members, who had come: Helen Estabrook, Alma Duffy, with the baby, Edna Malone, Ruth Holloway, and she listened to Aldous Crane lay out the case in the methodical, layered way of a man who had built it piece by piece over months and knew exactly which piece went where. Presented the original survey documentation, Ted Vance's creek map, Garrett Duffy's observation log with the Tennessee credentials attached. Presented the certified copy of the altered county record and the handwriting analysis. He called Garrett to testify, and Garrett sat before the territorial panel with the survey log in his hands and explained what he'd observed and how he'd documented it and what it meant, and he didn't stumble once. And across the gallery, Alma's expression was the one Clara had tried to describe to her on the porch. The thing you don't have to say, because you're already showing it. Meade's lawyers were expensive and capable, and they did what expensive, capable lawyers do with a bad case they complicated. They questioned credentials, they challenged methodology, they raised procedural objections, they introduced alternative interpretations of the survey language. It was thorough, and it was professional, and it was not enough, because the documentation was real, and the tampered record was real, and the pattern of 20 years was documented and real. On the second afternoon, the territorial panel withdrew to deliberate. The ranchers and their families sat in the corridor of the hearing building in Harrow, on benches against the wall, the way people sit when they've done everything they can do and waiting is the only thing left. Clara sat between Gideon and Alma. The baby had finally fallen asleep against Alma's shoulder. Calvin Holloway had fallen asleep in his chair, which James seemed to find both concerning and deeply characteristic, and he sat next to his father, watching his breathing with the attention of a son in the last of his father's years. Edna Malone did not sleep. She sat with her walking stick across her knees, and she watched the closed door of the deliberation room with the absolute patience of a woman who had decided what she was going to feel when the door opened and had nothing to do until it did. Gideon sat very still beside Clara. He was not a fidgeter, she'd learned that, and his stillness now was the same as his ordinary stillness, just carrying more weight. After a while, he said quietly, "Whatever happens in there." She looked at him. "Whatever happens in there," he said again. "I want you to know that what you did, the garden, the suppers, the gatherings, Alma Duffy's porch, riding out there yourself." He stopped. This was hard for him. She could see that, not because he didn't mean it, but because he was not a man who had practiced saying it. It changed what this ranch is, what this valley is. That's not contingent on the door. She looked at him for a moment, this man who had thrown a letter in the dirt and built things alone and let a garden die for 4 years because grief had no instruction for what to do with the soil someone left behind. "I know," she said. "I wanted to say it while we're waiting," he said, "because I say things better when I'm not reacting to them." She understood that about him. She'd understood it for a long time. "I know that too," she said. He turned back to the door, and she turned back to the door, and Edna Malone's walking stick rested across her knees, and the baby breathed against Alma's shoulder, and Calvin Holloway slept. And the corridor was quiet with the particular quality of a held breath that doesn't know, yet, whether it's going to release into relief or grief. The door opened after 3 hours. Territorial panel ruled in favor of the 5-ranch coalition on all primary claims. Meade's Dam was to be modified within 60 days to restore the original creek flow to its documented distribution. The water rights allocation was reset to the original survey boundaries. Court noted the evidence of record tampering and referred the matter to the territorial prosecutor for separate investigation. In the corridor, the announcement produced a response that was not the clean, erupting relief of a victory in a story. It was more complicated than that. Owens Esterbrook sat down heavily on the as though his legs had simply made a decision, and Helen put her hand on his shoulder and he covered it with his own, and neither of them said anything. James Holloway woke his father gently and told him, and Calvin listened, and then nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man receiving information he has expected for a long time, and is simply filing in its proper place. Ted Vance turned to the wall and stood there for a moment with his back to the corridor, and nobody intruded on that. Garrett Duffy looked at Alma, and Alma looked at him, and the baby woke up and looked at both of them. Edna Malone stood up from her bench with her walking stick, and she looked at Clara and said, "Without preamble, you should be proud of yourself. Everyone here should be proud of themselves," Clara said. "They should," Edna said. "And you should too. Those aren't different things." She moved toward her son, who was standing nearby with the expression of a man who had held a position under pressure and found, on the other side of it, that he was still there, that he had not collapsed in the way he'd been afraid he might. Gideon stood beside Clara in the corridor of the Harrow hearing building, the ruling in Aldous Crane's hand a few feet away, the valley's 5 families in various states of quiet and complicated relief around them. He didn't put his arm around her or make any gesture that would have been too large for the moment. Or for them, they were not at a place of large gestures. They were at the place where 2 people who have built something real, together, stand in the aftermath of having built it, which is quieter and more particular than any gesture. He said, "We should go home." She said yes. Harlan Meade did not disappear. That was something Clara had known to expect. And it was one of the things she tried to tell herself honestly, that real life did not resolve the way a story resolved, with the antagonist vanishing cleanly once he'd been defeated. Meade remained in the valley. His land remained his land. The investigation into the record tampering moved slowly through the territorial system as investigations moved. What changed was the texture of his influence. A man whose method depends entirely on people not cooperating with each other loses something fundamental when they start cooperating: his ability to offer private advantages, to manage individuals in isolation, to use the separateness of people as his operating environment. All of that required a particular kind of valley to work in, and the valley was no longer that kind. He made no more purchase offers. No more men appeared at ranch gates with good horses and practiced smiles. The rumor campaign stopped, either because it was no longer serving a purpose, or because Crane's preemptive filing had made it legally risky. He was still there, still North Still, the man who had dammed the creek and altered a record and spent 20 years on the assumption that the people around him would never build anything that could outrun his method. He had simply turned out to be wrong. The dam modification happened within the 60-day deadline under the watch of a Territorial Water Authority inspector, with Garrett Duffy present at Gideon's request to confirm it matched the surveyed boundary. Garrett took measurements. He documented everything. He wrote it up in his careful hand in the same log that had been attacked in the Millhaven paper, and the documentation was filed with the Territorial Authority, and it was clean and thorough and real. Done. Garrett rode back to the Duffy place and told Alma, and Alma made cornbread the Tennessee way that Clara had learned from her months ago, and they had supper together, just the four of them, with the baby finally properly crawling now and getting into everything. Clara had ridden out herself because Alma had asked her to, and she sat at the Duffy table in a house that was still bare in the way of a family in its first hard years. And she ate cornbread and listened to Garrett describe the inspection with the exact, pleased precision of a man who has been told his knowledge matters and has decided to believe it. And she thought about all the ways a thing could grow that had nothing to do with soil. Kitchen Garden at Hawthorne Ranch produced its second season with the particular abundance of ground that has been properly tended for the first time in years and is responding to the care with compound interest. Clara found herself planning expansions not because she needed to, but because the garden had become the thing the dead space in the yard used to prevent her from imagining. She added a section for cutting flowers, which Gideon noticed and said nothing about for 3 days, and then said, "The flowers aren't. What are you growing those for?" "'Cause they're worth growing," she said. He looked at her with the expression she'd long since stopped finding complicated, because she understood it now. It was the expression of a man to whom certain kinds of beauty had been unavailable for a long time, and who was recalibrating what he was allowed to want. "All right," he said. So Margaret retired from the full-time work of the house that fall not entirely. She was not a woman who stopped entirely, but she reduced to 3 days a week and said she wanted to spend more time at her sister's place in Millhaven. And Clara helped her arrange it and did not say what she was thinking, which was that Margaret had stayed at full capacity for as long as she was needed and had known, with the precise judgment of someone who understood the house better than anyone, that she was no longer needed in the same way. The day Margaret left for her sister's, she stood at the kitchen door with her bag and looked at Clara and said, "You know where everything is." "I do," Clara said. "The spice cabinet needs restocking in the fall. He forgets to order it." "I know, and Pell takes on too much without saying so. You have to watch for when he's tired." "I know that too." Margaret looked at her for a moment. She looked at the kitchen, the garden visible through the window, the recipe book on its shelf, the ordered larder, herbs drying from the ceiling beam that Clara had started doing because it preserved them better, and because her grandmother had done it, and because she liked the way they looked. "You fixed it," Margaret said. Clara shook her head. "It was already fixable." "That's not the same as fixed." She didn't have an answer to that wasn't just agreeing, so she let it sit. and Margaret went out to the wagon, and Clara watched her go from the window. The regular gatherings continued through the fall and into the winter, and they changed shape the way living things change shape as they mature, less urgent, less about the specific pressure of a specific threat, more about the ordinary, sustaining of something that had decided to exist. They added a fourth and fifth ranch to the rotation eventually. Smaller operations at the edges of the valley that had been too cautious to join early and were cautious no longer. The food was always good, not because Clara was at every one of them, but because she had shared the recipe book, not the original, which she kept, but a copied version she'd made by hand over 2 winter evenings, and the women of the valley had added to it from their own knowledge. Alma's Tennessee corn preparation, Helen Estabrook's salt-cured provisions, Dora Vance's bread that used a technique nobody else had seen before, Ruth Holloway's apple preserves. The book became a collective thing, added to and shared and returned, and Clara thought about her grandmother's careful handwriting and her mother's additions in a different ink, and about what it meant to leave knowledge behind in a form that someone else could carry forward. Thought about it one winter evening while the ranch was quiet and Gideon was in his office and the fire was going in the kitchen and the copy of the book was on the table in front of her, thicker now, with other hands writing. She had come here with 2 suitcases and this book and a letter she'd never asked to be written about her. She had not come here expecting to build what she'd built. She hadn't had a plan. She hadn't even had much hope in those first days, standing in the dust with the letter at her feet and 12 men watching, and a man who had not looked at her like a person. She had only had the habit of doing the next necessary thing, and then the next one after that, discipline of a woman who had learned very early that the world was not going to arrange itself to her convenience, and that waiting for it to do so was a form of surrender. She was not a person who surrendered. What she had not known, could not have known, was that doing the next necessary thing in front of people who were watching was its own kind of statement. That tending something in plain sight was a form of argument. The dead garden, and the blistered palms, and the supper for 12, and then 20, and then 50, and the letters written and the rides made, and the conversations held in kitchens and on porch steps, that all of that was not just the work of keeping a household or building a legal case. It was the construction of proof. Proof that a woman who had been described in a letter like livestock had a mind and a method and a capacity for consequence that was entirely her own. She had not set out to prove that. She had set out to survive, and then to contribute, and then to help, and then somewhere in there, she had stopped being careful about what she reached for. She heard Gideon's boots in the hall, and then the kitchen doorway. He looked at the book on the table, and then at her. "Working on something?" he said. "Thinking," she said. He came in and poured himself the last of the coffee, and sat down across from her at the kitchen table, which was where they'd had most of the conversations that mattered, and he looked at the copied recipe book with its accumulating pages. "Helen Estabrook asked me something when I rode out there last week," he said. Clara waited. "She asked if you'd be willing to help them think through a kitchen garden layout. Owen wants to start one in the spring. She said to ask you because you'd know what makes sense for their soil." Clara looked at the table. The kitchen garden at Hawthorne Ranch had started as a corrective, a dead space she'd looked at through the east room window and decided to reclaim, and had become, over time, a thing that apparently other people wanted to understand. "I'll ride out in March when the ground's ready. She'll be glad." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup between his hands. The Duffy boy, Garrett. "He told me something at the last gathering." "What?" "He said he's been approached by the Territorial Water Authority. They want to know if he'd be willing to consult on a water rights assessment they're doing in another county. Official capacity. Paid." Clara looked up. "It seems the documentation he produced for our case established him as someone who knows what he's doing," Gideon said. The tampered record situation drew attention. People noticed who put the original documentation together. She thought about Alma on the porch steps, and the baby on the blanket, and Garrett, who couldn't look at his wife because he'd been tempted. She thought of sitting in the hearing corridor, watching him testify without stumbling. He'll do well, she said. Yes, Gideon said. He will. The fire settled in the stove, with the sound of things finding their final arrangement. Outside, the winter pressed against the walls of the house in the way winter pressed here, not hostile, just indifferent, the cold doing what cold did without caring who was inside. They sat in the kitchen that had been dead and was alive now, in the house that had been flat and wasn't anymore, in the valley that had been fragmented and was finding its way to being something with a shape you could recognize. Clara looked at the recipe book on the table, her grandmother's handwriting, her mother's additions, her own, and now other women's, the collected knowledge of people who understood that feeding someone was not a small act, that bringing people to a table was not a small act, that the work done in the spaces everyone underestimated was not small work. She thought about the letter thrown in the dirt. She thought about picking it up and folding it without reading it, and sliding it into her pocket. That single gesture, refusing to open the wound in front of the audience assembled to watch her bleed. She had not known then that it was the first act of something. She had only known that some things were hers, and the letter was hers, and the audience was not going to have it. That instinct, the knowledge of what was hers. The refusal to let other people's definitions of her become her definition of herself that had been the beginning. Not a plan, not a strategy, just a woman who knew, somewhere underneath all the doubt and the difficulty, and the fear she'd carried on that wagon for 300 miles, that she was more than what the letter said, not more than she'd been told, more than had been seen. Those were different things, and the difference mattered. You didn't prove it by becoming something else. You proved it by doing the next necessary thing until the evidence was undeniable. You planted the garden, and you blistered your hands, and you made the soup, and you read the letter, and you rode out to the porch, and you held the coalition together not with speeches, but with food and presence, and the understanding that people who share a table regularly find it harder to be enemies. It was not glamorous, and it was not fast, and there were failures in it, the Malone situation that had almost broken at the worst moment. The night she'd sat alone at the kitchen table, not sure the gathering would hold. The argument she'd navigated by pretending not to be navigating anything. It had been imperfect and difficult, and sometimes she had been afraid, and sometimes she had been wrong, but it had been hers. Across the table, Gideon said, "What are you thinking about?" She looked at him, this man, who was still not easy, still not warm, in the way some people were warm, still inclined to build alone and say little, and carry things inside him longer than was probably good for him. He was better than he'd been. Not fixed. Better. There was a difference there, too, and it mattered. "I'm thinking about what you said at the hearing," she said, "about saying things when you're not reacting to them." He looked at her. "I want to say something when I'm not reacting to anything," she said. "I'm glad I didn't go home. Not because of the case, or the ranch, or any of it specifically." She paused, looking for the accurate shape of it. "Because this is the first place I've lived where what I actually am turned out to be useful, where what I could do was the thing that was needed. I didn't know that was possible to find." Gideon was quiet for a long moment. "It was here before you," he said finally. "The need. I just didn't know what it needed." That was as close to poetry as Gideon Hawthorne was likely to get, and she understood it was also completely accurate, and she found that she didn't need it to be anything more than that. "I know," she said. Outside, the valley lay in winter dark, 5 ranches in it, with their fires going, and their families inside, and the creek running at its legal flow through the frozen ground. And in the spring, it would run the same way, and the year after that, and the record was filed, and the coalition was real, and the table kept being set. Clara closed the recipe book. It was breakfast to think about in the morning, and a kitchen garden plan to sketch for Helen Esterbrook, and a letter she owed Aldous Crane, and 1,000 ordinary things that were not small. She had learned, finally, to know the difference between small and quiet. Most of the things that changed the world were quiet. They just required someone willing to keep doing them when no one was watching, and then keep doing them when everyone was watching and had already decided what they were seeing, and keep doing them until the evidence was undeniable, and the garden was alive, and the table was set, and the valley understood what it had almost lost. The fire settled again. Clara sat in the kitchen that was hers, in the life she had built from the space between a thrown letter and the decision not to open it in front of strangers. It was not finished. She didn't expect to be finished. She expected to keep going, which was something else entirely, and better.